Okay, welcome to New Space Race. As I saw to Bal earlier, since my whole monitor is covered by a screen, I will not see the question. So if anyone had any question during the presentation, then just ask, and hopefully Bal can interrupt me and ask the question directly. We want it to be interactive, so you are encouraged to ask questions. And I will try to go to the slides fast, so we'll have some time for discussion at the end. About myself. My name is Juanes Friedman. I'm a science fiction writer. I also write on Quora, a blog. I write like more than 2,000 articles there, and I had more than 4.2 million views. I get about 100,000 views a month. I write mostly about space stuff. Also have a YouTube channel called Sci-Fi, and this presentation, if all the recording will work perfectly, then I will put it on my channel. The channel was a 2022 Aurora finalist, and if anyone wants to engage me, the Twitter handle is below. So some of my work, The Fun Time is a novel, Escape Velocity is a short story collection, and a couple of other. I published 18 short stories and 2 books. What's the agenda today? First, we're going to talk a little bit about lesson learned from history. So we are going right now, humanity is going through a fundamental change when it comes to space exploration. In the very near future, we are going to switch to we are going to become a spacefaring. There is a good chance we'll become a spacefaring civilization. And the driving in the past for space exploration was a government agency, and now it's slowly moving to commercial agency who now at this time are starting to do a better job. This could be good, could be bad. I'm not judging, but it is your job to judge because you are writers. So you can either say positive things or negative things if you think it's terrible. And there are a lot of work that criticize what's going on right now with commercial space. But I'm going to start with the lesson from history about the age of exploration that occurs maybe 500-600 years ago. Then I'm going to review the old space race, the space race from the 1960s. So there are about 6 or 7 slides that are similar to what I put last year. And then we are going to review the 50 years of stagnation where there was not big advance in space exploration. Then we talk about SpaceX. This is right now they are at the forefront, doing very amazing stuff, and now becoming spacefaring civilization, other players in the market. And then we're going to start a discussion about can we have a Star Trek future that is not based on commercial, but based on the post-scarcity economy. And we'll see how it goes. So we are going to start with a history lesson. Just before the beginning of the age of exploration in the 15th century, the most powerful naval power in existence back then was China, Ming Empire China. Back then, the Ming has the least friction. That means you can have a big cargo ship going with less friction. That means they can travel with less energy to further distance, is the oceans. That was the means of transportation. In a similar way that today, space, or in the near future, space is going to be the place with the least amount of friction. In space, actually, there is virtually no friction at all. So you can go travel in space at a very high speed, and nothing is slowing you down. Water is a little bit beginning, but water was the big change in the age of exploration. So what happened in China? China back then, sent a huge fleet of treasure ship and other smaller ship led by Admiral Zhang He from around 1405 until 1433. They traveled the South China Sea. They arrived to the island like Taiwan, Philippines. Then they went to Malaysia, Indonesia, Indochina. They arrived to India, Arabia, Persia, and they even got to Africa. And they bought, so the fleet was no match on this planet. All the European powers that came into power years later, a few decades later, a few centuries later, Back then, China was the big naval superpower. Some more details. The Ming government sponsored 7 voyages through the Indian Basin and South China Sea. The treasure ship back then was 127 meters, according to some account, and according to other account, it was as big as 183 meters long. This huge ship had 9 masts, nothing like the ship that Columbus had 70 years later, with only 3 masts that were much smaller than. And in fact, those are the biggest wooden ships in history until the 20th century. And we are talking about the early 15th century, just before the age of exploration. The first voyage until 1405 was launched with 317 ships, 28,000 crewmen. Later Voyager has a bigger number of ships, I think up to 300,000 crewmen. And China was really dominated the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. They visit places like Brunei, Java, that's Indonesia today, Siam, it's Thailand, India, Arabia, the whole Africa. They use the diplomacy. Unlike the European conquistador, they came to America, they didn't try to come and conquer the land and convert everyone to their religion. They want to project power and establish commands and extract tributes. That was their goal. So they brought to China zebras and ostrich, camels, ivory, and giraffe. They even had some picture of giraffe in China. So they're pretty advanced civilization, advanced voyages. In 1424, the emperor that supported these voyages died. And his successor, the first successor was again the Voyager, the one above was also kind of lean against it, but allow one more voyage in 1433, and that was more or less the end of it. So this is an image of how the treasure ship may have looked like. You see this huge fleet with lots of boats. Some of them are really big, like 100 and something meter long. And there is a museum here that showed a 9-mast treasure ship when compared to the Santa Maria, one of the main ship that Columbus used to discover America. So China was a naval superpower. There was no competition. And even 70 years later, ship that the European built 70 years were dwarfed when comparing to what China had in the early 15th century. And then it ends. What happened? The Ming emperor decided to stop sponsoring the voyages. The argument was based on that these voyages cost a lot of money, a lot more than the tribute that they got from it back. So yeah, it's nice to project power, but we have other priorities. Back then, the Mongol Empire was starting to gain power. It was just driven out of China a few decades ago, and they were still behind the Chinese wall. So China, the Chinese emperor, thought that fortifying the Chinese wall, make it better manned, and under construction is a much higher priority. Defending the land is more important than project power through the sea. And of course, there was a bureaucratic power play in-house that they thought they didn't like Zhang He, didn't like the ships. They wanted everything to remain in-home. So there was objections. A few years later, to ensure that there are no more voyages, an order was given to burn all the documents and all the references to the voyages, and the order was also issued to prohibit any ship with more than 2 masts. Remember, the big treasure ship had 9 masts, and now it was illegal to build any ship with more than 2 masts. So you can have only small ship, even smaller than the Santa Maria Columbus ship. Now, there are some additional theory, and there are books written on the topic. There is no evidence for that. So there is no archaeological evidence and no documentation, some of it because the documentation was burned, of course, that a smaller detachment from the fleet may have even reached Europe and perhaps even America. Now, try to imagine what would happen if the China's Ming Empire had reached America and continue with the voyages. And they have a contact with the Aztec or the Inca empires, and they were able to give them information and maybe horses in exchange for some tribute or some tradings. So history of colonization and history of the age of exploration would have been completely different had the Chinese continue with the voyages. What was the aftermath of China's decision to burn all the big ship and shrink its navy to a very, very insignificant size? So China, which was the dominant naval power on this planet in the early 1400s, became an insignificant navy power. By 1500, that's only 70 years after Zhang He voyages, China was dominated by a small number, perhaps 10 ships from Portugal. They have a cannon, but they were pretty small. They could match China 70 years earlier, but since China has no navy, they were at least the coast was dominated by Portuguese. Later, smaller European nation, which has back then with insignificant naval power built, and the ships that travel the world and explore the world, they managed to circle Africa and go to America and Australia. So European nations were able to colonize America, Australia, and to control over India, Indochina, and most of the island in South China Sea, perhaps except for Taiwan. Including Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, those are taken by Spain and Holland and Portugal and Britain. They control the planet, and China remained confined to its own little space. And later in the 19th century, China was humiliated because the European power had the technology, had better guns, better ability to project power. And China was, they call it the century of humiliation, that started more or less in 1839 with the Opium War and ended after World War II when Japan was driven out of mainland China. So that's the story of a big government project that the government decided to cancel it and the implication that happened later. So does it ring any bell to the space program? Neil deGrasse Tyson, in a video presentation I did in 2018, I did a research, so I'm using his research. I didn't research it again for myself. And he reviewed throughout human civilization what encourage people or encourage civilization or country to invest a huge amount in a project, in a large project that one person or one small group couldn't afford to do it. So he found there were only 3 reasons why ancient civilization or even modern civilization engage in big projects. One is defense, survival. Example for investing a huge project in defense is, of course, China's Great Wall. This is the reason, one of the reasons why the Voyages stopped, because they needed the resources to invest in building a bigger and better wall. The interstates in the United States were also so. I think it was Truman or Eisenhower, after he came to Europe and saw the Autobahn in Germany, he decided it would be a good idea to do something similar in the United States, so it would be easier to transport tanks, materials, economic, to build from one side to the other side of the continent, not just rail. So it was built mainly for defense, but of course it has a lot of commercial use and private use in addition to the military use. And another thing that was very popular in the past, not so much today, is to glorify a deity. That's why we build the pyramids and the cathedrals in Europe. Today, this is not very popular. I don't think there is any major project today that take a significant portion of a GDP of a major nation to glorify a deity, but it was a thing of the past. And the last thing that drive huge economic investment in a particular project is for economic gains. One example is, of course, from the age of exploration, the East India Company, Dutch India Company, etc. And my feeling or my observation is right now that what we are seeing, that the investment in space is slowly moving from defense survival, that was the space race that was motivated by the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War ended. And now we enter a period of 50 years of stagnation. And now economic gain, economic companies are starting to invest in space for economic gains. So later we'll have a future discussion if we think there is anything in addition to those four, especially what could happen if we have a post-scarcity society. But let's go on. The Cold War. What spawned the first space race? Before World War II, we had a few empires that controlled the world, including the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russia that was replaced by the Soviet Union, America, Holland to some degree, Spain to some degree. Spain was in decline. But after World War II, only two superpowers remains, the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1946, right after the World War ended, and the Eastern Bloc, or Central Europe and Eastern Europe, was put under the Iron Curtain and were part of the Soviet blocs. There was a famous Churchill speech from 1946 about the Iron Curtain, and that was the beginning of the Cold War. Cold War, remember? Defense. We want to invest in defense. Cold War started in 1947. The government spent a lot of money in defense. That, of course, part of it was aviation and space. In 1947, the first Mark I flight, 1953. Mark II was reached, 1957. Intercontinental ballistic missile. And then the US was shocked when Russia launched the first satellites into space. That's really the society was like everything. They look up, and those who have radio receiver could see the beep, beep, beep signal that came from the Sputnik. The Soviets managed to launch something to space, and the US, that thought it was the #1 superpower, suddenly saw that the Soviet Union has an achievement that is better than them, at least in some respect. So this is not just an issue about being able to launch stuff to space, but also it can use for intercontinental ballistic missile. It could deliver nuclear bomb to the US. So that was a proof the Soviet Union can launch a nuclear war and destroy the United States. And also space was big, space was huge. It was beginning to see space like in the 15th century, nations saw the oceans. That's the next frontier. That's we don't want the Soviet to control the moon, the Mars. So America was shot, and America decided to fight back. And so the space will begin. Initially, the Soviet world, of course, had the lead. I put here the red is Soviet achievement, and blue is American achievement. Those are two superpowers in the space race, and the space was encouraged them to invest more money in more resources and get achievement and try stuff, take risks. 1957, the first dog in the space, Laika. 58 was America. First US satellites, they were behind. 59, first impact of another celestial body. The Soviet managed to send Luna 2 that crashed into the moon. In 1960, first animal in space. 1961, the Americans were launching the first chimpanzee in space, which was an achievement because chimpanzees are closer to humans. First human in space, again, big Soviet victory, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, 1961. Americans first in space, Alan Shepard, May 5, that's even less than a month after, but still the Soviets were able to claim, yeah, we are #1, we are the winner. First interplanetary flyby, first crew mission that lasted days, not just a few hours. 1962, first dual crew spacecraft, the Soviet again winning. They can send 2 people to space before the American. That was something that prompted Kennedy to declare that we choose to go to the moon speech. It was to encourage the entire nation to commit something like 5% of the all federal budget. That was more or less equivalent to later the Vietnam War. Now it's about 0.5%, but huge amount of resources was designed, that was put forward for one purpose, to show that the United States is #1. It can achieve the impossible, and that is to land people on the moon and bring them safe back to Earth. 1962.
Sorry, Ron. I don't know if you want to try and share screen again. You might be able to.
You sure?
Give it a shot.
Can you share it? See it now? Share.
I'm not seeing it.
Okay, so let's try to stop sharing.
Oh, some people can see it.
Oh, I stopped sharing and let me share again. Can you see it now?
I don't, but everybody else does, so that's good. As long
So
as the audience can see, let's go with it.
Can you confirm that people can see it?
Yep,
Yeah.
they are. They're all saying yes.
Okay, we chose to go to the moon. So the United States committed to send people to the moon by the end of the decade, so we have less than 8 years, and they committed a huge amount of resources, something like 400,000 people and 5% of the federal budget. That's huge. It's like the defense budget or something. But they saw it as a critical for defense, so that's why they invested so much. Still, the Soviets continued to lead. 1963, first woman in space. First time that people were able to stay in space for 5 days. 1964, first multi-person crew, 3 people in space. Soviets are still leading. 1965, spacewalk, again Soviets. American had the first spacewalk shortly after. First flyby to Mars. Again, that's not the first flyby against another planet, but the first one to Mars. And the first rendezvous in space, 2 spacecrafts meeting together, the Gemini 6 and Gemini 7, and were able to exchange astronauts. 1966, the Soviets are not done. First soft landing on the moon, Luna 9. It's a robotic probe. So there was a race to the moon. The Soviets can deny that, but they also tried to build the Energia, the big rocket, moon rocket, but the chief scientists died and the rocket exploded a few times, while the American chief scientist, von Braun, still alive and kicking. Okay, let's continue. Never had some dark history that he been a Nazi, but continue. First impact on another planet, Venus, again, the Soviets. And in 1966, late 1966, that's more or less when the Americans starting to lead the space race. A lot of people thought that the Soviets were leading up until the moon race, but actually the Americans start to get more achievement, better achievement than the Soviets already in 1966. First direct rendezvous, direct astronaut rendezvous, first artificial gravity. You know, everybody talk about spinning in space. We did it, the American did it in 1966, never again. All the rotating space station that we talked about, American experiments with artificial gravity, regrettably did not continue. 1968, first human spaceflight to orbit the moon. This is the one you see here, Apollo 8. It is inspired all environmental. When you the picture here after the Earth Day was at least partly inspired by this one picture that you see how small and fragile Earth is. It can give us a different perspective on how important planet Earth is and why we want to take care of it. Continue. January 6th, first crew exchange in space, docking between 2 spacecraft. So it's not just rendezvous, but also docking, open a hatch and switch crew. This was a Soviet victory. And then came the peak of the space race. The Americans were able to land on the moon July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong, 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for humankind. So it's not entirely clear when the space race ended. It could be, some argue, with the first landing on the moon, could be the last landing on the moon that occurred in 1971, or maybe even as late as 1975, when the Soviets and the Americans decided to stop racing one against the other and start to collaborate. And you can see here on the graph how in 1966, 1967, the budget was more than 4% of the GDP. I said 5%, that's slightly less. Huge amount of money was poured into the moon program. And then it started to went down. This is where the space race more or less ended in the early 1970s. Nixon nixed the the Saturn V and the Apollo program. And we went to a new age where the space agency had a much lower budget. Their main motivation was to survive, just keep what they have and not try anything too risky, and not having any budget to do anything was significant. There were quite a lot of achievements in robotic mission, like the Voyager mission, the Hubble Space Telescope, the rovers on Mars. But in terms of human space flights, we were never able, at least yet, to go back to the moon. We will remain confined to space, to low Earth orbit. So does it remind you something? Finding excuse. It's not entirely similar to what China did in the 15th century, but space program is too expensive. Public lost interest. They were not interested to such a huge amount spent on just to put people on the moon, to say, yeah, we are the best. There were other priorities. There was the Vietnam War, social unrest in the States. So 90% of the space program budget was slashed, and we stopped going to the moon. But another reason, if we get back to Neil deGrasse Tyson's argument, the US felt it won the race. There was no need for a defense to continue to invest in space. Remember, defense was no longer a motivation. And of course, there was still no economic reason for private company to build spacecraft. It was back then believed, up until recently, that only government agency can do things like that, because it's really not economic, so private companies will not do that. How did science fiction look in the late 1960s and early 1970s? Well, they were pretty optimistic about the future. Nobody imagined we are going to stop space exploration. So we went from, there was a huge advantage in aviation and space exploration from 1903, from when the Wright brothers built the first airplane, until 1969. In 1967, we had Lost in Space. We had the Star Trek that believed that in 1996, Han had the interstellar sleeper ship called the Botany Bay. They believed in 1996 we can send ship to other star system. 1968, there was a movie called 2001. So imagine they envisioned that by 2001 we'll have a manned mission to Jupiter and rotating huge space stations. This future didn't came true. Yeah, the moon base 1999, believed that we would have a moon base in 1999. Of course, we didn't. 50 years stagnation. How the 50 years of stagnation look like? Humanity's global capacity to launch payload to space remain at around 500 tons per year. 50 years, from the 1960s until the 2010s, we can only launch about, globally, all the countries combined. Human remain confined to low Earth orbit. The cost of launching payload to space was about between $10,000 and $60,000 per kilogram. The shuttle was very expensive, but ULA, the Delta Heavy and the Atlas were able to launch for something like $10,000. But it was actually worse than stagnation, because once the space shuttle was retired, America has lost the ability to even launch people to space. They have to rely on the Russians to use that still have this capability, and they are 50 or 60 years old hardware. It's a very old technology, reliable, but that's everything we had. So NASA's human spaceflight program costs about $350 billion, and they launch about 280 astronauts. If you do the math, it's more than $1 billion per person. A good TV series to watch is an alternate history called For All Humankind, highly recommended. What would happen if the Soviets were the first to land on the moon? And the space race would have continued into the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Right now, season 3 was released. It's on Apple TV. There is a race to Mars. So right now, only the 1990s that starts to involve a commercial space. But until then, they build the moon bases and nuclear rockets, and they managed to solve the problem of nuclear fusion. And space actually become economical. takes you helium-3 mining on the moon. So if the space race, this TV series about what would happen if the space race didn't end and would have continued for another few more decades. Highly recommended. Now we'll go to SpaceX. SpaceX today, love it or hate it. Right now, this is the data. In 2022, 2/3 of all the global payload to space was launched by SpaceX. And only 1/3 was launched by other American companies and European Space Agency, the EU, Russia, China, Japan, India, UK, United Arab Emirates. Yeah, so even the EU that launched the James Webb that's currently already in the news, all over the news. SpaceX did a lot more than the rest of the world combined. So that's the SpaceX is undoubtedly currently it is the queen. The cost of launching payload today, I'm not talking about future projects, it dropped by a factor of 5 from something like $10,000 per kilogram to $2,000 or even $1,700 if you use the Falcon Heavy. SpaceX already also restored the US ability to launch astronauts to the International Space Station and to low Earth orbit. But this is what will happen now. If you look at Starship, that's SpaceX's next project, this is going to be a game changer for the human species. It's going to be 100% reusable. That means you don't need to replace the ship or part of the ship or go into intensive few months refurbishment project. So it's reusable and high reusability. They claim it can even do multiple times a day. It can launch 100 to 150 tons to low Earth orbit. This is something similar to what the Saturn V could do in the 1960s, but no other rockets could do ever since. And with refueling, okay, we have, maybe we need to do, I'll leave it as it is. With refueling, it could, once it's in space, you can send a Starship tanker and refuel the crew or the deep space or the lunar Starship, and then it's going to be full refueled in space, and that means it can have a payload of 100 tons either to the moon surface or to Mars surface, or pretty much to almost anywhere on the solar system, at least the cargo. You cannot launch Starship to anywhere further than asteroid belt just because it will be a very, very long voyage. It takes years, but you can launch cargo to those places, maybe except for Jupiter and Saturn. And before space age, human global capacity to launch payload, this is a reminder for a few slides ago, was 500 tons per year. Human were confined to low Earth orbit, and the cost of launching payload to space was very expensive, and that remained like this for 50 years. If Starship is successful, this is going to change fundamentally our ability to access space. Yearly payload to space will go up to millions of tons, perhaps even tens of millions of tons. Let's assume you have a few dozens spaceships, starships, and each one of them can be launched once or perhaps even 3 times a day. So you do 100 tons times 3 times 665 times the number of space of Starship. We can get to tens of millions of tons. That's a lot more than 500 tons globally. So this is going to change. It means that we can colonize other planets. It means we can do asteroid mining. The price can be as low as $20 per kilogram, theoretically. I don't think it will be, at least not initially. But even if it's $200 per kilogram, this is going to be a game changer when compared to $1,000 or $10,000 per kilogram. This will make our civilization spacefaring. What other future revenues SpaceX is expected? Remember, it's a commercial company. They want to make profit. Perhaps they have some ideology about colonizing Mars and make life multiplanetary, but they want to make money. One revenue source is Starlink. It's an internet network that's going from satellites. They plan to initially deploy something like 12,000 satellites and eventually 40-something thousand satellites to provide internet connection in rural areas all over the planet, or at least on any country that agree to have it. They already have, I believe, 20-something countries, including the US and Canada and Ukraine. Another thing they can do once Starship is get the license to be human rated, so they probably have to do a lot of unmanned flights before they can launch people into space. But once you remember, we're talking about water is a lot less friction media than going on land. Space has a lot less friction than water. That means you can launch also less than air. You can launch a rocket from New York to Beijing or to Tokyo that can land there in maybe 40-45 minutes instead of flying for 16 hours, which is could be a big pain. So even if they charge something like first class or business class, like $20,000 per person, they can still be economical, and like we have thousands of flights per day, so they can make a lot of money from that in the future, not initially. Starlink is already operational. Then what they can get money from customers who want to launch payloads to other to space or to other interplanetary bodies. This could include NASA, other space agency or private entities, and mining in space. There are a lot of resources in space. We're not going to talk about them deeply, but yeah, there are a lot of materials in space that could either be used in space, like water and stuff. You don't want to bring them to Earth, you want to utilize it in space, or precious metal like gold, platinum, rare earths, mineral, etc., that could either be used in space or even brought back to Earth. But SpaceX is not the only commercial player right now. Today, even if Elon Musk will die and SpaceX will bankrupt, this is not the end of commercial spaceflight, because now companies and individuals know that a commercial company, motivated commercial company that can work in a very efficient way and well-funded, that have billions of dollars behind it, can do it. They can launch payload to space, and they could be profitable. One of these companies that recently watched carefully, and you may want to check, it had not flown yet. It has a few engineers that left Blue Origin, that's the Jeff Bezos company, and they got some funding for, forgot, another billionaire, I think, forgot his name. So anyway, they are building right now a rocket that looks very, very similar to Starship, but smaller. That means it's going to be 100% reusable. But it only have something like 20 tons to space and to low Earth orbit instead of 100 tons. But again, their mission is to go to Mars, and perhaps they even land on Mars before SpaceX. That's their plan. Not with people, but with payload, with a robotic mission. And another thing that's interesting about relativity space is what they do with 3D printed. So they basically print the engine, print the spacecraft. So that's significantly reduce the cost of building spaceships and engines. And yeah, and the goal is Mars. Another interesting company built by a non-billionaire, just an engineer who managed to convince investor to build the company, is Rocket Labs. The Proton rocket, they launch a few missions to space. They are partly reusable. They want to be fully reusable. It's another successful company. Another one is Axiom Space. They want to build a space station and they want the NASA contract to build a lunar spacesuit. Most of the time they are using SpaceX rockets to get into space, but then they are building their own stuff and using their own things. Sierra Space, they have a spacecraft that look like the shuttle, but a lot smaller. It could compete with the Dragon, SpaceX Dragon capsule that launched people to space and payload to space. And Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, they are, I don't know, they move very slow right now. But there is a new player, we've been in the beginning of the presentation, China. China is currently very motivated to invest in space. They're still behind the United States, but they're now working on the third space station. They plan to build a moon on the base in the late 2020s. So that's maybe 2-3 years after NASA, but I don't know if the American will decide to take a little slack and rest. China may win the race to the moon and build a moon base before the Americans. And they also set their eye on Mars. The goal is then 2040s. That's pretty late, but I don't know. They may be able to get them. So they're a big player right now. There is a chance they will win if the Americans decided to, I don't know, to kill SpaceX and defund NASA. So in summary, just before we go to the Q&A session, what motivates us? This is just a repeat of what we did. Defense, survival, example is the space race. And what we are moving right now is economic gain. We want to build large projects in space, and colonize space is like the East Indian Company. So we are not going to colonize places that have natives, indigenous people there. So that's one good thing, but still there is a lot of room for things to go wrong. So if you're a science fiction writer, you can write a dystopia that can very well fit into this, but you can also do positive science fiction based on that. Depends on you. Not investing in cutting-edge exploration is a mistake. If the United States decided, yeah, we are cutting down on space, we don't care about space, we want to invest in Earth, then somebody else will take its place, and then perhaps the People's Republic of China will control the solar system. And it's for us, it's not going to be a good prospect. Maybe it is, I don't know, but we want to go to space. We don't want to neglect that field, which is the next frontier. And humanity's ability to go to space was stagnated for 50 years, but this is now changes, and it's changed. We are about to become a spacefaring civilization, and the main motivation right now is economical, and companies who want to do things for profit. So this is finished the presentation. We have about 7 minutes for discussion. So reminding you, I wrote like more than 2,000 articles, so please feel free to ask questions. Some topic that I suggest for discussion is commercial space, utopia or dystopia, or something in between. Why invest in space? A lot of people argue that we shouldn't. Why do we want to build a colony on Mars? And what is the next step? What's going to happen after commercial space? Can we have a future similar to Star Trek, when economy is not the real motivation? Can we get to this future? Do we need the Zafram Cochrane in order to be in space before we can go to the Star Trek future? So I'm open for Q&A.
Okay, there's a question here from Angela. What do you think about the safety of the private space flights happening now, and how come?
What do you think about the safety of the private space flights? You're talking about the Dragon. Dragon 2, SpaceX Dragon 2, that's the only commercial spacecraft that... So first of all, they are being launched from the US, United States. They need to be licensed by NASA and the FAA, the Federal Aviation, something, I forgot the acronym. So I think right now, because of all the disaster that the shuttle had, and also the Saturn V, the shuttle have something like 4% chance of exploding. So they had 135 flights, 2 of them exploded, but I think they said that even a higher chance than that to explode. When they launched the shuttle, they didn't do any uncrew mission. From the get-go, it was crew mission. Dragon, first of all, there was the Dragon 1. What is certified for human right now is only the Dragon 2 spacecraft and the Falcon 9 Block 5. That is the latest block, and they had to fly at least 7 successful unmanned flight to space before they got the permission to fly humans. And they did more than 10 landings with deploying the parachutes, and they did all kind of experiments. With 2 parachutes, it was enough to land. They have 3, so they have a lot of redundancy. And other things that they have that the shuttle didn't have they have the, I forgot the exact name, but they have the external Draco engine that if there is some problem during launch, the capsule they have their own engine, they can detach and then deploy the parachutes and land on a safe distance from the rest of so they have multiple backups. So I don't know what is the safety range. I think NASA want to have something like 99% safety. So there's still 1 in 100 flight could go wrong and explode, but it's probably safer than the space shuttle.
Okay. I think I might have read Angela's question wrong. I'm not totally up on my space stuff. So that last part of her question, and to come, I said, and capital T-O, come, I'm not understanding it myself, but if you do.
Capital T-O, how do you spell it?
T-O capitalized. And we do have another question here.
Maybe I'll stop sharing,
Oh, I
or maybe
didn't
I launch
read
the
the to
QA.
come. And to come. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Angela.
And to come. Okay, to
Yeah,
come,
yeah.
I'll,
And for the newer, what's coming up?
okay,
Is
what's
it
coming
just going to
up?
get safer and safer if I
Okay,
understand it?
okay, what's coming up is 2 projects that are going on right now, or maybe more. One is the NASA SLS project, that's in their next moon program. They are going to do only, I think only one or two unmanned launch, because this is a super expensive project that's going to cost like $4.1 billion per launch, not 200 million or 100 million, but 4 point something billion. But it's based on shuttle components, so it has the shuttle booster, shuttle engine, and also they have the ability to, if something goes to the spacecraft, to detach and land separately, the emergency system. So this one is not going to be tested 7 times before it's launched, but since they are using existing technology from the 1980s that was proven with more than 100 flights, that's the assumption that it's going to be safe. The other thing is Starship Crew. That one, probably we're going to see a lot of uncrew flights before that one is certified. It doesn't really have an emergency detachment system. Maybe the upper stage can detach because it has their own engine and go around. So I don't know how it's going to look like. But the first mission to the moon, the lunar SLS, that's the one that's going to land on the moon, it's the astronauts are not, it will certify to fly people on space, but not launching them from Earth. I would say it will take a few years before it will be launched for Earth. So the first moon mission, you have the SLS launching on the Orion capsule, and then going to rendezvous in lunar orbit with the lander that is a Starship that will certify to land on the moon and fly in space. It have the life support system, but it is not certified to launch from Earth with humans and land on Earth with humans. So it will, after the end of the mission, they have to go back to Orion. They can do the same thing with other spacecraft, like the Dragon 2. What else we have? We have Boeing are building the Starliner. This one is being delayed. It's going to be more expensive. So I don't know how it's going to work, but they also need to do the 7 flights before they are certified for humans. And then we have the Sierra Sierra Nevada or Sierra, yes, I forgot the name of the spacecraft that look like the shuttle. So initially they're going to use it for cargo, and only after a number of flights, they may be able to be certified for humans. So
All
that's where it
right.
stands.
Thanks, Ron. There's another question here from Dan. Do we have any concrete times on when Starship is going to be ready to go?
That depends, go where. Elon Musk said that it will be ready to go, he expects a successful launch to orbit for a test experiment with the payload, not humans, sometime between 1 month and 12 months. So that's they launch to orbit and then it lands. I think they will also try to capture the Megazilla, the big Megazilla, with the big chopsticks. We try to capture the booster. This is going to be amazing. But for judging from history, the way SpaceX works, Their motto is build, try, fail, build again, try, fail, repeat, and every time you improve until you get to a position when it works. So there is a good chance the first few missions are going to explode spectacularly. This is part of the process. Now it's going to be a little more challenging because each space Starship need 38 or even 41 engines, and each engine is expensive and takes time to build. So they may be a little bit more cautious because they want to preserve the engines. Yeah, so first flight in a few months. Flight to the moon, I think the original plan is 2023 for a mission around the moon and come back, the Beer Moon private mission. So probably it's not going to be certified to launch humans from Earth, so I expect it to launch it to Earth orbit, and then they will use the Dragon to bring the people to, and then they can transfer to the, after it is refueled in space, to transfer to the Starship and go from there. When Starship will be certified for human, I don't know, a few years.
Cool. All right, there's another question here from Z. Very informative, thank you.
So just a comment, we ran out of time. I don't mind staying
Yeah, it's
here.
when will the recordings for your panels be posted and where?
Okay, I need to check. I can put it next week on my YouTube channel, Sci and Sci-Fi. I think if you, maybe I'll go to
put it in the chat. Oh, he's got a slide ready for that.
So
Awesome, Ron. Thank you.
YouTube channel, the Sci-Fi. If you want the Twitter handle, I think there is a link for there. And if you want my blog on Quora, with the one with the millions of views, spacefaringcivilization.quora.com, and those have link to all the other places. So I expect maybe next weekend, if the recording is fine, to put it on my YouTube channel. And potentially in a few months, it will also be maybe on the When Worlds Collide channel. I don't know, my YouTube channel has more views typically. So.
All right. Well,
So
thank
I'll
you.
try to put it there soon.
Thank you so much, Ron. This was really interesting. Sorry I couldn't get that slideshow going for you earlier, because I love that. I love pictures with talks.
Yeah, so you can take a screenshot or a phone photo of how to connect with me and ask for more people, and yeah, you can invite it to watch a channel or check my YouTube, Amazon, whatever.
Yeah, I would suggest you check Ron's YouTube channel out. I've done that, and it's just so chock full of great information. And
it was an Aurora finalist this year for fame.
Yeah.
It's not yet commercial.
Hey. So thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you all again next year, I hope. So next year, When Worlds Collide is on the first August weekend, not the second one, the first one. So I do believe that is covered it up, 4th, 5th, and 6th of August, 2023. And it looks like, barring any big changes, we may be in person in Calgary, Delta Hotel on Southland and McLeod South. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm stopping the recording.